You are standing in your kitchen. Rain hits the window. You barely notice it. But somewhere deep in your brain, something old is listening. Because for most of human history, water was not background noise. It was the difference between waking up tomorrow and not waking up at all. And the real answer to how your ancestors survived it is far stranger than you think. Start with this. Around 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was not a sea. It was a freshwater lake, ringed with farms and villages. Then the Mediterranean broke through a narrow strip of land near modern-day Istanbul. Salt water poured in fast. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman studied the seafloor sediment decades later. What they found stunned them. The water rose by several inches a day for months. Entire valleys vanished. People had weeks, not years, to decide whether to run. Some didn't believe it was happening. Some waited too long, but the ones who survived shared one trait. They moved early and they moved together. That single behavior, moving early and moving together, shows up again and again in the archaeological record. It might be the oldest survival strategy humans ever developed. Here's the strange part. Flood myths exist on nearly every continent. Mesopotamia has one. So does China. So does Australia's Aboriginal oral tradition, passed down for thousands of years before writing existed. Why would cultures with no contact tell almost the same story? One theory, championed by geologist Patrick Nunn, is unsettling. He argues some of these stories are not myths at all. They're memories, encoded in rhythm and repetition so they could survive for 10,000 years without a single written word. Think about that. A grandmother telling a story to a child, who tells it to her grandchild, who tells it to his, for 400 generations. Not for entertainment, for survival. So the next flood wouldn't catch anyone by surprise. Your ancestors didn't have satellite warnings. They had story as infrastructure. But stories alone don't stop water. So what did? Elevation. Humans have always been drawn to rivers because rivers meant food, transport, and fertile soil. But settle too close and the same river becomes an enemy. Early agricultural communities in the Fertile Crescent solved this by building on natural mounds called tells. Layer after layer, generation after generation, villages rebuilt slightly higher than the last. Some tells in modern-day Iraq rise over 40 feet above the surrounding plain. Not because anyone planned a monument, because every flood forced people to add another layer, and eventually those layers became a hill. That's not architecture. That's memory, built in dirt. Now consider ancient Egypt. The Nile flooded every single year and Egyptians didn't fight it. They built their entire calendar around it. Akhit, the flooding season. Pere, the growing season. Shemu, the harvest. An entire civilization organized around water they knew was coming because predictability turns a disaster into a rhythm. Anthropologist Carl Butzer studied this extensively. He found that Egyptian irrigation systems weren't just about farming. They were social contracts. Communities that cooperated on canal maintenance survived. Communities that didn't starved when the flood came in. Wrong. Cooperation wasn't kindness. It was infrastructure. This is where it gets interesting for you sitting here right now. Psychologists have found that humans today still carry an outsized fear response to rising water, even people who've never experienced a flood. Some researchers link this to what's called prepared learning, a concept explored by psychologist Martin Seligman. Certain fears, snakes, heights, drowning, seem to require almost no personal experience to trigger. Your brain arrives preloaded with caution because the humans who lacked that caution didn't pass on their genes. You don't remember the Black Sea flood, but some quiet part of your nervous system might still be listening for it. Notice how you feel watching flood footage on the news. That tightening in your chest isn't random. It's ancient. There's one more piece to this. Survival wasn't only physical, it was social. Anthropologists studying disaster response consistently find the same pattern across cultures and centuries. Groups that shared resources during a crisis had dramatically higher survival rates than groups that hoarded them. Not because sharing is noble, because a village divided against itself drowns twice as fast. This is the part modern life quietly erases. You don't need your neighbor to survive a bad week anymore. Food arrives regardless. Water runs regardless. But the wiring for cooperation, forged over 10,000 years of shared floods and shared fields, is still sitting there underneath the convenience. So what does all this mean for you? Standing in your kitchen, half listening to rain on the glass. It means the part of you that flinches at rising water isn't paranoia. It's inheritance. It means every flood myth your culture ever told wasn't fiction. It was a warning system disguised as a bedtime story. And it means the impulse to check on your neighbors, during a storm isn't just courtesy, it's an 8,000-year-old survival strategy, still running quietly in the background. Consider what happened further south along the Yellow River in ancient China. Chinese mythology tells the story of Yu the Great, a legendary engineer who spent 13 years fighting the floods, so consumed by the task that he passed his own house 3 times without stopping to go inside. Historians debate how much of Yu is myth and how much is memory, but the lesson embedded in the story is oddly practical. Yu's father tried to block the water with dams and walls. He failed and the floods got worse. Yu changed strategy. He dug channels. He worked with the water's direction instead of against it. That single shift from resistance to redirection appears again and again wherever ancient humans face repeated flooding. Fighting water head on rarely worked. Guiding it did. You can see the same logic in the raised field agriculture of the ancient Maya in the Yucatan lowlands. Archaeologists have mapped networks of canals and elevated planting beds built centuries before European contact. Rather than avoiding the flood-prone wetlands, Maya farmers turned the flooding into fertilizer, channeling seasonal water to deposit nutrient-rich silt exactly where they needed it. The flood wasn't only a threat, it was, if managed correctly, a resource. That reframing shows up in psychology too. Researcher Barbara Rothbaum, who studies fear and trauma, has noted that the difference between a paralyzing fear and a manageable one often comes down to a sense of control. Ancient communities that treated floods as an unpredictable punishment panicked. Communities that mapped the pattern, tracked the season, and built systems around it adapted. The water didn't change. The relationship to it did. Now think about what this required, generation after generation. Someone had to remember the water lines from the last flood. Someone had to teach the next builder where the tell needed another layer. Someone had to keep the story of the flood alive long enough for it to matter 50 years later, when nobody left alive had actually seen it. That's not just survival. That's the invention of institutional memory, thousands of years before anyone had a word for it. You're listening to everyone who came before you, telling you, one more time, to pay attention.